The rain fell like a judgment over the city, drumming against the roof of the black Cadillac as it rolled through streets that had forgotten the meaning of light. Vincent Marconi sat in the back seat, his fingers tracing the edge of an ivory envelope that had arrived that morning. The paper was expensive, the kind that whispered of old money and new arrogance. Inside, embossed in gold script, was an invitation to the engagement party of Elena Russo, the woman who had once promised to stand beside him until death, and the man she had chosen instead. Carlo De Luca, a banker, a man with soft hands and softer convictions. Vincent's jaw tightened as he read the names again. Elena Russo and Carlo De Luca request the honor of your presence. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. 3 years had passed since she walked away, since she told him she couldn't live in his world anymore, couldn't sleep beside a man whose hands were stained with the work of the family. She had cried, he remembered. She had begged him to leave it all behind, to run away with her to some distant place where the name Marconi meant nothing. He had refused. The family was his blood, his oath, his only god. And so she left. Now she was marrying a man who wore tailored suits, bought with clean money, who attended charity galas and shook hands with politicians, a man who would never understand what it meant to hold power in silence, to command respect through fear and loyalty alone. Vincent folded the invitation and slipped it back into his coat pocket. He had no intention of attending. Let her have her fairy tale. Let her pretend she had escaped. But then the old man appeared. It was 3 days after the invitation arrived. Vincent had been overseeing a meeting at one of his clubs, a dimly lit establishment on the edge of Little Italy where the family conducted business away from prying eyes. The capos had gathered to discuss territory disputes, collection routes, and the usual matters of discipline. Vincent listened with the detached focus of a man who had heard it all before, his mind elsewhere, circling the memory of Elena like a vulture over carrion. When the meeting ended, he stepped outside into the alley for a cigarette. The air was thick with the smell of garbage and rain. Across the street, beneath the flicker of a dying street lamp, he saw him, an old man, hunched and frail, pushing a shopping cart filled with bottles and cans. His clothes were layered rags, his face weathered like old leather. He moved slowly, methodically, pausing at each trash bin to sift through the refuse, with hands that trembled from age or cold or both. Vincent watched him for a long moment, smoke curling from his lips. There was something achingly familiar about the old man, though he couldn't place it. A ghost from another life, perhaps, or simply a reminder of what the world looked like when you stripped away the power and the fear. The old man glanced up and their eyes met. Vincent felt something shift in his chest, a flicker of recognition he couldn't name. The old man held his gaze for a heartbeat, then lowered his head and continued his work, pushing the cart down the alley and into the shadows. That night, Vincent couldn't sleep. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood by the window of his penthouse, staring out at the city that bent to his will. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the glow of neon and streetlights. Somewhere out there, Elena was preparing for her engagement party, choosing flowers and seating arrangements, smiling at her banker fiancé as if the past had never happened. And somewhere out there, the old man was still pushing his cart, invisible to everyone but Vincent. An idea began to form in his mind, strange and dark and undeniable. The next morning, Vincent summoned his underboss, Marco Vitale, to his office. Marco was a man of sharp instincts and sharper violence, loyal to Vincent in the way a wolf is loyal to the pack. He had been with the family since he was 16, rising through the ranks on a foundation of blood and silence. Marco entered the office and closed the door behind him. He wore a black suit, perfectly tailored, his dark hair slicked back in the style of men who understood that appearance was a form of armor. Vincent gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Marco obeyed, his expression neutral, waiting. Vincent leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I need you to find someone for me." Marco nodded. "Who?" "An old man, a recycler. I saw him 3 nights ago in the alley behind the club. He pushes a shopping cart, collects cans and bottles." Marco's brow furrowed slightly. "You want me to find a homeless man?" Vincent's gaze didn't waver. "Yes." Marco hesitated, then asked the question Vincent had been expecting. "Why? Because I'm going to bring him to a party." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken questions. Marco knew better than to press, but Vincent could see the curiosity burning behind his eyes. Finally, Marco nodded. "I'll find him." It took 2 days. Marco's network of soldiers and associates combed the streets, following the routes where the city's invisible people moved like shadows. They found the old man in a narrow alley near the docks, sorting through a dumpster behind a seafood restaurant. Marco approached him alone, offering money and a warm meal in exchange for a conversation. The old man's name was Thomas Greco. He had been a longshoreman once, decades ago, before the docks changed and the work dried up. He had a daughter, he said, but he hadn't seen her in years. Life had broken him slowly, piece by piece, until all that remained was the cart and the bottles and the quiet rhythm of survival. Marco brought him to Vincent's estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind iron gates and tall hedges. The old man stood in the foyer, small and fragile beneath the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Vincent descended the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing on marble. He stopped a few feet away from Thomas, studying him with the same intensity he had shown in the alley. "Do you know who I am?" Vincent asked. Thomas shook his head slowly. "No, sir. My name is Vincent Marconi. I run this city in ways you'll never see, and I have a proposition for you." Thomas's hands trembled. He clutched his worn cap between his fingers. "I don't want no trouble, mister." Vincent smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "There won't be any trouble. I want to take you somewhere. A party. You'll be my guest." Thomas blinked, uncomprehending. "A party? An engagement party. Very fancy. You'll wear a suit, eat good food, drink good wine, and all you have to do is stand beside me and say nothing." The old man looked down at his ragged clothes, then back at Vincent. "Why me?" "Because you're perfect." Vincent turned and gestured to Marco, who stepped forward with a garment bag. Inside was a suit, custom-tailored, simple but elegant. Shoes, a shirt, a tie. Everything Thomas would need to look like he belonged in a world that had long ago forgotten him. Thomas stared at the suit as if it were a trap. "I don't understand." "You don't need to," Vincent said quietly. "Just trust me. I'll take care of everything. And when it's over, I'll make sure you're taken care of too. A place to stay, money, whatever you need." Thomas's eyes filled with tears, though he tried to blink them away. "Why would you do this for me?" Vincent's expression darkened. "Because someone needs to remember that not everyone gets to forget where they came from." The old man didn't argue. Perhaps he was too tired. Perhaps he sensed that refusing Vincent Marconi was not an option. Or perhaps, deep down, he understood that this strange, wealthy man was offering him something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. 3 days later, Vincent stood in front of the mirror in his dressing room, adjusting his tie. The suit was charcoal grey, impeccably cut, a statement of power without ostentation. His reflection stared back at him, a man in his late 30s with dark eyes that had seen too much and a face that revealed nothing. Behind him, Marco waited by the door. "The old man's ready, boss." Vincent nodded. He slipped on his cufflinks, each one engraved with the Marconi family crest, and turned to face his underboss. "How does he look? Like he walked out of an old photograph?" Marco paused. "Boss, are you sure about this?" Vincent's smile was cold and certain. "Absolutely." They descended the staircase together, and at the bottom, standing in the foyer, was Thomas Greco. The transformation was startling. The suit fit him perfectly, disguising the frailty of his frame. His white hair had been trimmed and combed, his face shaved clean. He looked like a man who had once been someone important, someone who had walked through halls of power and influence before time and circumstance stripped it all away. Thomas met Vincent's gaze, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Then, Vincent extended his hand. "You look distinguished, Thomas." The old man took his hand, his grip weak but sincere. "Thank you, Mr. Marconi." Vincent released his hand and gestured toward the door. "Let's go to a party." The drive to the engagement venue took 30 minutes. The party was being held at the Belle Vista Estate, a historic mansion on the river that had been converted into an event space for the city's elite. As the Cadillac pulled up to the entrance, Vincent saw the glow of lights through the windows, heard the distant murmur of music and laughter. Valets in white jackets rushed forward. Vincent stepped out first, then turned to help Thomas, who moved slowly, carefully, like a man stepping onto holy ground. Together, they walked up the marble steps and through the grand entrance. Inside, the world was gold and crystal and champagne. Chandeliers hung from frescoed ceilings. Women in elegant gowns glided across polished floors. Men in tailored suits stood in clusters, discussing business and politics in low, confident tones. And there, at the center of it all, stood Elena. She was radiant, her dark hair swept up in an elaborate style, her dress a cascade of ivory silk. She laughed at something her fiancé said, her hand resting on his arm, the diamond on her finger catching the light. Vincent felt the old familiar ache, the one he had buried beneath layers of anger and pride, but he buried it again now, deeper this time, and forced himself to smile. Elena's eyes found him across the room. Her laughter died. Her face went pale. She stared at Vincent as if he were a ghost, as if the past had torn through the present and dragged her back into a world she thought she had escaped, and then her gaze shifted to the old man standing beside him. Vincent watched her carefully, studying every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. Confusion, shock, and then something else. Something he hadn't expected. Recognition. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears. Vincent's smile faded. Because Elena Russo wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at Thomas Greco. And in that moment Vincent realized he had made a terrible mistake. He didn't know this old man at all. But Elena did. The ballroom fell silent in waves. First the guests nearest to the entrance, who turned to see what had drawn Elena's attention. Then the circles beyond them, conversations dying mid-sentence as heads turned and eyes followed the trajectory of her stare. Within moments, the entire room was watching. Vincent stood motionless, his hand still resting lightly on Thomas's shoulder. He had expected shock, perhaps disgust, maybe even anger. He had wanted Elena to see how far he was willing to go, how little her new world of respectability meant to him. He had wanted her to feel small and ashamed in front of her banker fiancé and all their pristine friends. But this was something else entirely. Elena moved through the crowd like a woman in a dream, her ivory gown flowing behind her. The guests parted instinctively, creating a path. Her fiancé, Carlo, reached for her arm, confusion etched across his handsome, unmarked face, but she pulled away without looking at him. She crossed the ballroom floor, her eyes never leaving Thomas. The old man stood frozen, his weathered hands trembling at his sides. Vincent felt him begin to pull back. A small instinctive retreat, but Vincent's grip on his shoulder tightened. "Stay," he whispered, though he no longer knew why. Elena stopped 3 feet away. Her face was streaked with tears, her carefully applied makeup running in dark rivulets down her cheeks. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She tried again, her voice breaking on the first syllable. "Papa." The word hung in the air like smoke. Vincent's blood turned to ice. Thomas Greco stared at the woman before him, his eyes wide and wet and full of something Vincent had never seen in all his years of commanding men. Pure, unbearable recognition. His lips moved soundlessly, forming a name he hadn't spoken in what must have been decades. Elena. She collapsed forward, and Thomas caught her, his frail arms somehow finding the strength to hold her as she buried her face against his chest and sobbed. The sound was raw and animal, the kind of grief that had been locked away for so long it had calcified into something harder than bone. Vincent stood there, his hand now empty, his carefully constructed plan disintegrating around him like ash in wind. The guests began to murmur, a low susurrus of shock and confusion, and barely concealed delight at the scandal unfolding before them. Carlo pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Elena, what is the meaning of this? Who is this man?" But Elena didn't answer. She clung to Thomas as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become untethered. Thomas held her, his old hands stroking her hair, with a tenderness that spoke of a lifetime of loss. Vincent felt Marco materialize at his elbow. "Boss," Marco whispered urgently, "we should go." But Vincent couldn't move. He watched Elena and Thomas, watched the way they held each other, and felt something crack open inside him that he had spent years trying to seal shut. Finally, Elena pulled back just enough to look up at her father's face. She touched his cheek with shaking fingers, as if confirming he was real. "How?" she whispered. "How are you here?" Thomas's voice was rough, broken by years of silence and shame. "I don't know, sweetheart. I don't know." Elena turned then, her eyes finding Vincent across the small distance that separated them. The look she gave him was one he couldn't decipher. Not gratitude, not anger, but something complex and layered and painful. "You brought him," she said. It wasn't a question. Vincent nodded slowly. "I didn't know. I know." Her voice was steady now, though tears still streamed down her face. "But you brought him anyway." The crowd pressed closer, hungry for more, but Elena raised her hand and her voice, addressing them all. "This man is my father. He's been gone for 23 years, and tonight, he's come back to me. A ripple of shock moved through the guests. Carlo stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Elena's mother, an elegant woman in her 60s, who had been holding court near the champagne fountain, went white as death. Elena turned back to Thomas. "Come with me, Papa, please." She took his hand and led him toward a side door, away from the crowd, away from the lights and the music and the judgment. As they passed Vincent, she paused. Her eyes met his one more time, and this time he saw it clearly. Forgiveness, unexpected and undeserved. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she was gone, and Vincent was left standing in the middle of a ballroom full of strangers who looked at him like he had just torn open a wound they didn't know existed. Marco touched his arm again. "Boss, we need to leave. Now." Vincent allowed himself to be guided toward the exit. Behind them, the murmurs grew louder, transforming into open speculation and gossip. Carlo stood alone in the center of the floor, his engagement party in ruins, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. Vincent didn't look back. The drive back to the estate was silent. Vincent stared out the window at the passing streets, his mind replaying the moment over and over. Elena's face. Thomas's trembling hands. The word Papa falling from her lips like a prayer. Marco finally broke the silence. "Did you know?" "No." "Then, how did you find him?" Vincent closed his eyes. "Luck, coincidence, God playing games." Marco was quiet for a moment. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing." Vincent opened his eyes. "Find out everything. Who Thomas Greco is, why he disappeared, where he's been, all of it." Marco nodded. "And if Elena contacts you?" Vincent's jaw tightened. "Then I'll deal with it." But Elena didn't contact him that night, or the next day, or the day after that. The silence was heavier than any confrontation could have been. Vincent threw himself into family business, overseeing collections, mediating disputes between capos, handling the 1,000 small matters that kept the Marconi empire running. But his mind was always elsewhere, circling back to that moment in the ballroom when everything he thought he understood had shifted beneath his feet. It was Marco who brought him the information. 3 days after the engagement party, he laid a manila folder on Vincent's desk, his expression carefully neutral. "Thomas Anthony Greco," Marco began, "born 1945, longshoreman for 30 years, married to Lucia Moretti in 1968. One daughter, Elena Maria Greco, born 1972. Vincent opened the folder and found photographs, documents, newspaper clippings. He listened as Marco continued. In 2002, Thomas lost his job when the shipping company he worked for went bankrupt. He couldn't find steady work after that. Started drinking. The family went into debt. Lucia took a job as a seamstress, but it wasn't enough. They were going to lose their house. Vincent's fingers traced over a photograph of a younger Thomas, standing with his arm around a dark-haired woman and a teenage girl. They were smiling. They looked happy. Thomas started borrowing money, Marco said quietly. Small amounts at first from friends, from relatives, then bigger amounts from worse people. Vincent looked up. Who? The Baldini family. Vincent's blood went cold. The Baldinis were loan sharks, vicious and unforgiving, the kind of men who broke fingers as casual warnings. They operated on the fringes of the Marconi territory, too small to be a real threat, but dangerous enough to cause pain. How much did he owe them? 50,000. Vincent let out a slow breath. That was a death sentence for a man like Thomas. He couldn't pay, Marco continued. The Baldinis gave him a choice, work for them or watch his family suffer. Thomas refused. He told them he'd find another way, but there was no other way. What happened? Thomas disappeared, just walked out one night and never came back. Lucia and Elena thought he was dead. The Baldinis let the debt go because there was nothing left to collect. Vincent closed the folder. Where has he been all this time? Streets, shelters, under bridges. Marco's voice was flat, factual. He's been homeless for 23 years, moving from city to city, trying to stay invisible. He came back here about 6 months ago. Why? Marco shrugged. Maybe he was dying. Maybe he just wanted to see home one more time. Vincent stood and walked to the window. The city spread out before him, a maze of light and shadow. Somewhere out there, Elena was learning the same story. Somewhere out there, she was grappling with the fact that her father had sacrificed everything to keep her safe. What do you want to do, boss? Marco asked. Vincent didn't answer immediately. Finally, he turned back to his underboss. Find out where Elena took him. Make sure they have everything they need. Money, a place to stay, medical care if he needs it. Marco raised an eyebrow. You're helping them. Vincent's voice was cold and certain. I started this. I'll finish it. Marco nodded and left. Vincent returned to the window, his reflection staring back at him from the dark glass. He had wanted revenge. He had wanted to hurt Elena the way she had hurt him. Instead, he had given her back the one thing she had lost and could never replace. The irony tasted like blood in his mouth. 2 weeks passed. Vincent heard through Marco's network that Elena had moved her father into a small apartment near the river, that she visited him every day, that she had hired nurses to help him recover from decades of neglect and exposure. He heard that Carlo had called off the engagement, unable to stomach the scandal and the whispers that followed Elena everywhere she went. He heard that Elena's mother, Lucia, had refused to see Thomas, had told Elena that he was dead to her and should stay that way. Vincent heard all of this and said nothing. Then, on a cold evening in late autumn, his doorman called up to inform him that he had a visitor, a woman named Elena Russo. Vincent stood in his living room, suddenly aware of how empty the penthouse felt, how sterile and cold. He straightened his tie, poured 2 glasses of wine, and told the doorman to send her up. When the elevator doors opened, Elena stepped out. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back, her face free of makeup. She looked younger than she had at the engagement party, but also older, as if the past 2 weeks had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time. "Hello, Vincent." Elena. They stood there, 2 people who had once planned a life together, now separated by a chasm neither knew how to cross. Elena took a breath. "I came to thank you, and to understand." Vincent gestured to the sofa. "Sit, please." She sat and he handed her a glass of wine. She took it but didn't drink, just held it between her hands like she needed something to anchor her. "I didn't know," Vincent said before she could speak. "I saw him in an alley. I thought bringing him to your party would embarrass you, make you remember where you came from, who I am. It was petty and cruel, and I'm not going to apologize for that." Elena nodded slowly. "I know." She looked down at the wine. "But you still did it. And because you did, I have my father back." Vincent sat across from her. "Marco told me what happened, why he left." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "He thought he was protecting us. He thought if he disappeared, the Baldinis would leave us alone. And they did. My mother and I survived. We moved to a smaller place. She worked 3 jobs. I put myself through school. We made it. But you never knew. We thought he abandoned us. We thought he chose his shame over his family." Elena's voice broke. "I hated him, Vincent. For years I hated him. And all that time he was out there, living like an animal, because he loved us too much to drag us down with him." Vincent said nothing. There was nothing to say. Elena wiped her eyes and looked at him directly. "Why did you really bring him there? To hurt you?" She nodded. "That's honest. I wanted you to see what your new life looked like next to someone who had nothing. I wanted you to feel ashamed. And now I don't know what I feel." Elena set down her wine glass. "My father asked about you. He wanted to know who you were, why you helped him. I told him you were someone I used to love." "Used to?" She smiled, sad and broken. "Yes, used to. Because the man I loved wouldn't have done what you did. Not for revenge, not for anything." Vincent felt the words land like a blade between his ribs. "But I'm grateful anyway," Elena continued. "Because even though you meant to hurt me, you gave me back something I thought was lost forever." She stood. "That's why I came here, to tell you that, and to say goodbye." "Goodbye? I'm leaving the city. My father and I. We're going somewhere quiet, somewhere we can start over. He doesn't have much time left, the doctors say, maybe a year, maybe less. I want to spend it with him." Vincent rose to his feet. "And your mother?" Elena's face hardened. "My mother made her choice a long time ago. She chose bitterness. I'm choosing something else." "What about Carlo?" "Gone." She shrugged. "He wanted a society wife, not a woman with a homeless father and a broken past. I can't blame him." Vincent stepped closer. "And me?" Elena looked up at him, and for a moment he saw the girl he had fallen in love with, the girl who had believed they could escape their histories and build something new. "You're the Don, Vincent. You always will be, and I can't live in that world." She reached up and touched his cheek, a ghost of a gesture. "But I'll never forget what you did, even if you'll never understand why it mattered." Then she turned and walked to the elevator. Vincent watched her go, watched the doors close, watched the numbers descend. And when she was gone, he poured himself another glass of wine and stood at the window, staring out at the city that had taken everything from everyone and given back only shadows. Somewhere out there, Thomas Greco was sleeping in a warm bed, his daughter beside him, the weight of 23 years finally lifting. And Vincent Marconi, the Don of the city, stood alone in his tower, surrounded by everything he had won and nothing he wanted. He raised his glass to the empty room. "To ghosts," he said. Then he drank. Winter came early that year, descending on the city like a curse. The streets turned grey and brittle, the sky hung low and oppressive, and the cold seeped into everything, even the bones of men who thought themselves untouchable. Vincent threw himself into the work of the family with a ferocity that surprised even Marco. He personally oversaw every operation, every collection, every sit-down with rival crews. He was present at the docks when shipments arrived, in the back rooms when deals were negotiated, in the alleys when discipline needed to be administered. He became a ghost that haunted his own empire, omnipresent and unreachable. His capos noticed. They whispered among themselves that the Don had changed, that something had broken inside him the night of Elena's engagement party, but no one dared ask. Omerta wasn't just about keeping secrets from outsiders. It was also about respecting the silence of those above you, especially when that silence was edged with something dangerous. Marco was the only one who came close to breaching that wall. It was late December, 3 months after Elena had left. Vincent sat in his office reviewing ledgers by lamplight, when Marco knocked and entered without waiting for permission. He carried a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. Vincent looked up. "I didn't call for you." "I know." Marco set the glasses on the desk and poured. "But you should have." Vincent watched as Marco filled both glasses, then slid one across the desk. "What's this about?" Marco sat down and took a drink. "The consigliere came to see me today, old Sal Benedetti." Vincent's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. Sal Benedetti was the family's counselor, a man in his 70s who had advised Vincent's father and grandfather before him. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with the weight of decades behind every word. "What did he want?" "He's concerned about you, boss. Says you're burning yourself out. Says you're making decisions like a man who doesn't care if he lives or dies." Vincent picked up his glass but didn't drink. "Tell Sal I appreciate his concern, but I'm fine." "With respect, boss." "You're not." The room went silent. Vincent set down his glass with deliberate care. "Be very careful with your next words, Marco." Marco met his gaze without flinching. "You've been running this family since you were 25, 10 years. You've never made a mistake, never shown weakness, never let anyone see you bleed. But something's changed. The soldiers feel it. The capos feel it. And if we feel it, eventually our enemies will too." Vincent leaned back in his chair. "What exactly do you think has changed?" Marco took another drink, choosing his words. "That night at the engagement party, you went there to humiliate her, to prove you were stronger than whatever she walked away from. But it didn't work out that way. You gave her a gift instead, and now you can't reconcile who you wanted to be with who you actually are." Vincent's jaw tightened. "You're overstepping." "Maybe." Marco set down his glass. "But I've been your underboss for 6 years. I've stood beside you through wars, through betrayals, through nights when we weren't sure we'd see morning. So I'm going to overstep one more time and tell you what I think." Vincent said nothing, but his eyes were cold and dangerous. "You loved her," Marco said quietly. "Really loved her. Not the way a Don loves a woman, like she's a prize or a possession. You loved her the way a man loves a woman when he's willing to burn the whole world down to keep her safe. And when she walked away, it nearly destroyed you. But you buried it, you turned it into anger, into pride, into fuel for the empire." Marco leaned forward. "But then you saw her again, and you saw her father, and you saw what sacrifice actually looks like when it's not wrapped up in power and violence and family obligations. You saw a man who gave up everything, who became nothing, just to protect the people he loved. And it broke something in you because you realized you never would have done that. You would have fought, you would have killed, you would have burned the Baldinis to ash and scattered them to the wind, but you wouldn't have disappeared." Vincent's hands curled into fists on the desk. "Thomas Greco became a ghost to save his family," Marco continued. "But you, boss, you've been trying to become a ghost for the opposite reason. You think if you work hard enough, if you're ruthless enough, if you never stop moving, you can forget that you're still human, that you still feel things, that she still matters." The silence that followed was absolute. Vincent stared at Marco, his expression unreadable, his breathing controlled. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Vincent picked up his glass and drained it in one swallow. "Get out," he said softly. Marco rose to his feet. He didn't apologize. He simply nodded, left the whiskey bottle on the desk and walked out. Vincent sat alone in the lamplight, the taste of whiskey burning in his throat. Outside, The city sparkled with Christmas lights, false cheer strung across streets that had never known real joy. He poured himself another glass and drank it slowly, methodically, waiting for the numbness to set in. It never did. The next morning, Vincent woke to find an envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a single card, handwritten in elegant script. Thomas Greco passed away peacefully on December 21st, surrounded by love. A memorial service will be held at St. Anthony's Church on December 28th at 2 p.m. You are welcome to attend. There was no signature, but Vincent knew Elena's handwriting. He read the card 3 times, then set it on his desk and stared at it for the rest of the day. The morning of the memorial, Vincent dressed in a simple black suit, no tie, no cufflinks, no outward signs of wealth or power. He looked like any other mourner. Marco offered to accompany him, but Vincent refused. This was something he needed to do alone. St. Anthony's was a small church in the old neighborhood, the kind of place where generations of immigrants had been baptized, married and mourned. The pews were worn smooth by countless hands. The stained glass windows depicted saints with sorrowful eyes, and the air smelled of incense and ancient wood. Vincent arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the back row. He watched as people filtered in, a modest crowd of maybe 40 or 50. He recognized a few faces, old longshoremen who must have known Thomas decades ago, some nurses who had cared for him in his final months, a handful of neighbors from the apartment building where Elena had taken him. Elena entered last, dressed in black, her face pale but composed. She walked to the front pew and sat alone. Her mother, Lucia, was not there. The service was simple. A priest spoke about redemption and forgiveness, about the prodigal father who had returned home. A few people rose to share memories of Thomas from his younger days, stories of a man who had been strong and kind and devoted to his family. Elena sat through it all with quiet grace, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes dry. When it was over and the mourners began to file out, Vincent remained seated. He watched Elena stand and approach the simple casket at the front of the church. She placed her hand on the polished wood and stood there for a long moment, her head bowed. Then she turned and saw him. She walked down the aisle slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty church. When she reached his pew, she stopped. "You came." Vincent nodded. "I wanted to pay my respects." Elena sat down beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. They sat in silence for a moment. Two people bound by a history they could never fully escape. "He asked about you," Elena said finally. "Near the end, when the pain medication made him confused, he thought you were someone from his old life, someone who had shown him kindness once. I didn't correct him." Vincent's throat tightened. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." She turned to look at him. "He had 3 good months, Vincent. 3 months of sleeping in a warm bed, eating real food, being loved. That's more than he had in 23 years. That's because of you. I didn't do it for him. I did it to hurt you." "I know," she smiled sadly. "But grace doesn't care about intentions. You set something in motion, and it became something beautiful despite you." Vincent had no response to that. Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph. She handed it to him. This was taken 2 weeks before he died. Vincent looked at the photo. It showed Elena and Thomas sitting on a porch, both of them smiling. Thomas looked thin and frail, but his eyes were clear and peaceful. His arm was around his daughter's shoulders, and she leaned into him like she had when she was a child. "He was happy," Elena said. "At the end, he was happy. He told me he'd made peace with his choices, that he'd do it all again if it meant keeping me safe." Vincent stared at the photograph, at the old man who had sacrificed everything, at the daughter who had forgiven him. He thought about his own father, a Don who had ruled with an iron fist and died alone in a hospital room, surrounded by soldiers who feared him but didn't love him. He thought about the empire he had built, the respect he commanded, the power he wielded, and he realized that Thomas Greco, homeless and broken and invisible, had been richer than Vincent would ever be. He handed the photo back to Elena. "You should keep this." She took it and slipped it back into her purse. "Where do you go from here?" Elena looked toward the altar, where candles flickered in the dim light. "Away. Somewhere without memories. Somewhere I can start over. Will you come back?" "I don't know. Maybe someday. When it doesn't hurt anymore." She turned back to him. "What about you? Where do you go?" Vincent almost laughed. "I don't go anywhere. I'm the Don. This is my city. I'll be here until someone puts a bullet in me or I'm too old to care anymore." "That sounds lonely." "It is what it is." Elena reached out and took his hand. For a moment, Vincent was so surprised he almost pulled away. But he didn't. He let her hold his hand. let her warmth seep into his cold fingers. "You're not as hard as you think you are, Vincent Marconi. Somewhere inside, you're still the man I fell in love with, the man who wanted to be more than his name." Vincent looked down at their joined hands. That man died a long time ago. Maybe. Elena squeezed his hand once, then released it. Or maybe he's just been sleeping. She stood and smoothed her dress. "Goodbye, Vincent. Goodbye, Elena." She walked down the aisle and out into the pale December sunlight. Vincent watched her go, watched the door close behind her, and then he was alone again in the empty church. He sat there for a long time, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on him. He thought about Thomas Greco, about sacrifice and redemption, about the difference between strength and power. He thought about his father, about the family, about the oath he had sworn and the life he had chosen, and for the first time in a very long time, Vincent Marconi allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loneliness. When he finally stood and walked out of the church, the sun was beginning to set. The sky was streaked with red and gold, the color of fire and blood and endings. He pulled his coat tight against the cold and headed back toward his car, where Marco waited with the engine running. Marco looked at him as he climbed into the back seat. "How was it, boss?" Vincent settled into the leather upholstery and stared out the window. Quiet. They drove in silence through the city streets, past the neighborhoods where Vincent's power reached into every corner, where his name was spoken with fear and respect. But as they passed St. Anthony's one last time, Vincent looked back and saw the small church standing resolute against the gathering darkness, and he wondered not for the first time if he had chosen the wrong kind of immortality. That night, Vincent sat in his office with the lights off, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the city that sprawled before him like a kingdom built on sand. Marco's words echoed in his mind. "You're burning yourself out. The soldiers feel it. The capos feel it." He thought about Elena's words too. "You're not as hard as you think you are." And he thought about Thomas Greco, the ghost who had become a man again, if only for 3 months. Vincent raised his glass to the empty room. "To the ghosts who haunt us," he said quietly, "and to the men we might have been." He drank alone, as he always did, as he always would. The dawn of the city, the loneliest man in the world. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the streets in a blanket of white, making everything look clean and new and innocent. But Vincent knew better. Nothing in this city was ever clean. Nothing was ever new. And innocence was just another word for weakness. He poured himself another glass and watched the snow fall until morning came, and the city woke up and demanded his attention once more. The empire never slept, and neither did he. Spring arrived like an unwelcome guest, bringing rain and renewal to a city that had forgotten how to change. The snow melted into dirty rivers that ran through the gutters, carrying away the illusion of purity winter had briefly offered. Vincent watched from his office window as the world turned green again, indifferent to his presence, indifferent to everything he had built. 6 months had passed since Elena left. 6 months since Thomas Greco's memorial service. 6 months of running the family with mechanical precision, of making decisions that needed to be made, of maintaining the empire his father had built and his grandfather before him. But something had shifted in the undercurrent of the organization, something Marco had warned him about. The soldiers were restless. The capos were watching him too closely. And in the shadows, Vincent sensed the stirring of ambition. It started with small things, a collection that came up short, explained away as a mistake in accounting, a shipment that arrived late, blamed on weather and traffic, a sit-down with a rival crew that ended in shouting instead of agreement. Individually, these were nothing, but together they formed a pattern. Someone was testing him. Vincent called a meeting of the capos in late March, at the club where he had first seen Thomas Greco all those months ago. 7 men arrived, each commanding their own crew, each with their own territories and operations. They sat around a long table in the back room, smoke from cigarettes and cigars hanging in the air like fog. Vincent stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the back of his chair. He studied each man in turn, reading their faces, their postures, the small tells that revealed more than words ever could. Marco stood behind him, silent and watchful. "We have problems," Vincent said finally. His voice was calm, measured, dangerous. "Collections are down. Shipments are delayed. Our relationships with the other families are strained. Someone wants to tell me why." The capos exchanged glances. Finally, one of them spoke. Dominic Russo, a heavy-set man in his 50s who controlled the gambling operations in the South End. Times are changing, Don Marconi. The old ways don't work like they used to. We need to adapt. Vincent's eyes narrowed. Adapt how? Dominic leaned forward. The younger soldiers, they don't have the same respect for tradition. They see what's happening in other cities, how the families are modernizing, diversifying. They want more than the old neighborhood rackets. Vincent remained perfectly still. And you think this justifies the sloppiness I've been seeing? Another capo spoke up, Tony Bianco, who ran the loan operations in the East. With respect, Don Marconi, it's not just about the operations, it's about leadership. The room went cold. Vincent's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Choose your next words very carefully, Tony. Tony didn't back down. He was younger than Dominic, mid-40s, ambitious and smart. The men need to see strength. They need to see that you're focused on the family, not distracted by personal matters. Vincent felt Marco tense behind him, but he raised a hand slightly, a silent command to wait. Personal matters, Vincent repeated. You want to be more specific? Tony glanced at the other capos gathering courage from their silence. The engagement party, the old man, Elena Russo, the men talk, Don Marconi. They say you've been different since then, distant, distracted. Vincent let the silence stretch, let the tension build until it was almost unbearable. Then he walked slowly around the table, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. He stopped behind Tony's chair. Stand up. Tony hesitated, then rose to his feet. He was taller than Vincent, broader in the shoulders, but in that moment he looked small. Vincent stepped close, invading his space. You think I'm distracted? Tony's jaw tightened. I think the family needs to come first. Always. Vincent nodded slowly. You're right. The family does come first. It always has. Which is why I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. Who sent you to say this? Tony's eyes widened fractionally. Nobody sent me. I'm speaking for myself. Vincent smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You're lying. He turned and addressed the table. Someone in this room thinks I've become weak. Someone thinks the incident with Elena Russo makes me vulnerable. Someone has been whispering poison in the ears of my capos, testing my authority, waiting to see if I'll break. The capos remained silent, but Vincent could see the calculation in their eyes, the weighing of odds and consequences. So I'm going to make this very simple, Vincent continued. Whoever is behind this has 24 hours to come to me directly and explain themselves. If they do, we'll handle it like men. If they don't, I'll find them myself. And when I do, I'll make an example that this family will remember for the next 50 years. He let that sink in, then turned back to Tony. Sit down. Tony sat, his face pale. Vincent returned to the head of the table. Meeting's over, get back to work, and make sure your houses are in order because I'm going to be paying visits, personally. The capos filed out in silence. Only Marco remained. When the door closed, Marco spoke. Tony's not smart enough to organize this on his own. I know, Vincent said. Someone else is pulling the strings. Who do you think? Vincent walked to the window and looked out at the alley where he had first seen Thomas Greco. The old man's ghost seemed to linger there, a reminder of choices and consequences. Someone who thinks I've lost my edge. Someone who's been waiting for an opportunity. Marco came to stand beside him. Sal Benedetti came to see me again yesterday. The consigliere. Vincent turned to look at his underboss. What did he say? That there's talk among the old guard. They think you're too young, too reckless. They remember your father, how he built this empire with iron and blood. They worry you're going soft. Vincent's laugh was bitter, soft. Because I showed a moment of humanity. Because you let a woman matter more than the family, Marco corrected gently. In their eyes, that's the same thing. Vincent stared out at the alley. And what do you think? Marco chose his words carefully. I think you're the best Don this family has ever had. I think you're smarter than your father, more strategic, more willing to adapt. But I also think you're carrying something heavy, and it's starting to show. Vincent said nothing. You want my advice, boss? Marco continued. Find whoever's behind this. Make it brutal. Remind everyone why they fear the Marconi name. Then, when the dust settles, take a step back. Let the capos run their operations. Trust your people, and maybe find a way to let go of what you can't change. Vincent closed his eyes. Some things can't be let go, Marco. Then learn to carry them better. That night, Vincent sat in his penthouse and made phone calls. Not the usual business calls, but something different. He called in favors, activated informants, set his most trusted soldiers to watching and listening. By midnight, he had a clearer picture. The conspiracy, if it could be called that, centered around three capos, Dominic Russo, Tony Bianco, and a third man named Frank De Luca, who ran the waste management operations in the north. They had been meeting in secret, discussing the future of the family, questioning Vincent's leadership, but they weren't the architects, they were the followers. The real power behind the challenge came from an unexpected source, Sal Benedetti, the consigliere. Vincent should have seen it sooner. Sal had been his father's closest advisor, the man who whispered strategy in the old Don's ear. When Vincent had taken over at 25, Sal had accepted it because the transition was smooth and legitimate, but he had never fully approved. To Sal, Vincent was too young, too modern, too willing to negotiate when the old ways demanded blood. And when Vincent had shown vulnerability at Elena's engagement party, when he had let his personal feelings affect his judgment, Sal had seen an opportunity, not to take power himself. Sal was too old, too pragmatic for that, but to install someone more malleable, someone who would listen to the old guard and restore what Sal saw as the proper order of things. Marco brought Vincent the final piece of evidence 3 days later, a recording of Sal meeting with the three capos, outlining a plan to force Vincent out, not through violence, but through a vote of no confidence among the senior members of the family. They would argue that Vincent had become unstable, that he was risking everything over a woman, that he needed to step down for the good of the organization. Vincent listened to the recording twice, his face expressionless. "What do you want to do, boss?" Marco asked. Vincent stood and walked to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a black velvet box. Inside was his father's ring, the one that had marked him as Don. Vincent had never worn it, preferring to lead through respect rather than symbols. He slipped it on his finger now. "Set up a meeting, full family gathering. Tomorrow night. Everyone attends." Marco nodded. "And Sal, tell him I need his counsel. Tell him I'm struggling with a decision, and I want his wisdom." Marco understood immediately. "He's going to think you're about to step down. Let him think that." Vincent's voice was cold. "Let them all think that." The next evening, the family gathered in the private dining room of a restaurant Vincent owned in Little Italy. It was a place where generations of Marconis had celebrated victories and mourned losses, where the walls held the memory of 100 secret conversations. Long tables had been set up in a U shape. Vincent sat at the center with Marco on his right. The capos and their key soldiers filled the other seats, more than 40 men in total. At the far end of one table sat Sal Benedetti, his white hair immaculate, his expression serene. Vincent waited until everyone was seated, until the wine had been poured and the first course served. Then he stood. The room fell silent immediately. "Thank you all for coming," Vincent began. "I know many of you have been concerned about the direction of the family. You've seen changes in me and how I lead. You've wondered if I still have what it takes to be your Don." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled faces. "I called you here tonight because I've made a decision, one that will affect all of us." Sal Benedetti leaned forward slightly, anticipation in his eyes. Vincent continued, "Over the past year I've learned something important. I've learned that strength isn't just about power. It's not just about fear or respect or the ability to crush your enemies. Real strength is about knowing who you are and what you stand for, even when the world tries to tell you you're wrong." He walked slowly along the table, his voice carrying clearly. "Some of you think I've become weak because I showed compassion, because I helped an old man and his daughter, because I allowed myself to feel something other than ambition and rage." Vincent stopped walking and turned to face the room. "You're right, I did those things, and I'd do them again." A murmur ran through the crowd. Vincent raised his hand for silence. "But that doesn't make me weak. It makes me human. And the day I forget that, the day I become nothing but the title and the power, that's the day I stop being worthy of leading this family." He returned to his place at the center of the table. "However, I understand that some of you disagree. Some of you think I should step down, that I should hand power to someone who will lead the old way with nothing but iron and blood." Vincent pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and unfolded it. "This is a list of names. 3 capos and 1 consigliere, who have been meeting in secret planning to remove me from power." The room exploded into shocked whispers. Vincent let it build, then held up his hand again. "Dominic Russo, Tony Bianco, Frank De Luca, stand up." The 3 capos rose slowly, their faces pale. Around them soldiers shifted uncomfortably, hands moving toward weapons. Vincent's voice cut through the tension like a blade. and Sal Benedetti. Stand up. Sal rose with dignity, his expression calm. If he felt fear, he didn't show it. Vincent walked toward them. You four have committed treason against this family. You've plotted to undermine my authority, to sow discord among my soldiers, to replace me with a puppet who would dance to your tune. He stopped in front of Sal. The consigliere met his gaze steadily. In the old days, Vincent said quietly, my father would have had you killed, all of you. He would have made it slow and public and terrifying. Sal nodded. Yes, he would have. Vincent turned to address the room. But I'm not my father. I don't rule through fear alone. I rule through respect, through loyalty, through the understanding that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. He faced the four conspirators again. So here's what's going to happen. Dominic, Tony, Frank, you're out. Effective immediately. You're stripped of your positions. You'll turn over your operations to men I trust and you'll leave this city. You have 1 week. The three capos looked shocked, almost relieved. Exile instead of death was a mercy they hadn't expected. Vincent turned to Sal. And you, old man, you've served this family for 50 years. You advised my grandfather, my father, and you tried to advise me, so I'm not going to kill you either. Sal's eyebrow raised slightly. But you're no longer consigliere. You're retired. You'll keep your pension, your protection, your respect, but your voice in family matters is done. Vincent stepped closer, his voice dropping so only Sal could hear. You thought I was weak because I felt something. But feeling something and acting on it are two different things. I brought that old man to the party, yes. I hurt Elena, yes. But in the end, I gave them both something they needed, even if I didn't mean to. That's not weakness. That's power you never understood. Sal studied Vincent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're right. I didn't understand. But I do now. Vincent stepped back and addressed the room. This family was built on blood and loyalty. But loyalty works both ways. You give it to me and I give it to you. You stand with me and I'll stand with you. But the moment you plot against me, the moment you put your ambition above the family, you're done. He returned to his seat and sat down. Now let's eat. We have business to discuss. The meal resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. The soldiers looked at Vincent with new eyes, seeing not the young Don who might be vulnerable, but the leader who had just outmaneuvered a conspiracy without spilling a drop of blood. After dinner, as the men filed out, Marco leaned close to Vincent. That was brilliant, boss. You showed mercy and strength at the same time. Vincent watched Sal Benedetti leave, the old man walking with his head high despite his defeat. I showed them what I learned from Thomas Greco. What's that? That sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from violence. Sometimes mercy cuts deeper than a knife. Marco considered this. And if they come back? If Sal tries again? Vincent's voice turned cold. Then I'll show them what I learned from my father. That night, alone in his penthouse, Vincent stood at the window and looked out at the city. The light sparkled like stars fallen to earth, beautiful and deceptive. He thought about Elena, wherever she was now. He thought about Thomas Greco, the ghost who had taught him more in death than most men teach in life. He thought about the choice he had made tonight, to lead with both strength and humanity, to be more than just a title and a name. It was a lonely path, but it was his path. Vincent raised his glass to the empty room. To the men we become, he said quietly, despite everything. Then he drank and turned away from the window and got back to the work of being Don, because the city never slept, and neither did the weight of the crown he wore. 2 years passed like water through open fingers. Vincent rebuilt the family with careful precision, replacing the exiled capos with younger men who understood that loyalty and intelligence mattered more than brutality. He promoted soldiers who showed initiative, who could think beyond the old neighborhood rackets and adapt to a changing world. Under his leadership, the Marconi Empire grew stronger, more diversified, more resilient. But the city changed too, in ways both visible and invisible. Old buildings came down, and new ones rose in their place. Neighborhoods that had been Italian for generations became something else. Waves of new immigrants bringing different languages and different dreams. The world was moving faster now, and even the shadows had to evolve or die. Vincent moved with it, always one step ahead, always watching, always calculating. He attended meetings with legitimate businessmen and corrupt politicians. He brokered peace between rival families. He invested in restaurants, construction companies, waste management. The Marconi name became synonymous not just with fear, but with power that had learned to wear a suit and speak softly. But late at night, When the city finally quieted and Vincent stood alone in his penthouse, he sometimes thought about the old man in the alley. He thought about Elena's face when she recognized her father. He thought about Thomas Greco, who had given up everything and gained back his soul. And he wondered if power was worth the price of never being able to do the same. It was a Thursday evening in October when Marco knocked on Vincent's office door with an unusual expression on his face. Not concern exactly, but something close to it. Vincent looked up from the contracts he was reviewing. "What is it?" "Someone's here to see you." Marco hesitated. "She says her name is Elena Rousseau." Vincent's pen stopped moving. He set it down carefully, his face revealing nothing. "She's here. Now. Downstairs in the lobby. She asked if you had a few minutes." Vincent stood and walked to the window, buying himself time to think. 2 years. 2 years since the memorial service, since their last conversation in the empty church. He had assumed she was gone forever, living some quiet life far away from the city and everything it represented. "Send her up," he said finally. Marco nodded and left. Vincent straightened his tie, smoothed his jacket, and realized with dark amusement that he was nervous. Vincent Marconi, the Don who faced down conspiracies and rival families without flinching, was nervous about seeing a woman he had once loved. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. Elena stepped out. She had changed. Her hair was shorter, just past her shoulders, and there were fine lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there before. She wore simple clothes, jeans, and a sweater, and carried a worn leather bag over her shoulder. She looked older, but also somehow lighter, as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been set down. "Hello, Vincent." "Elena." He gestured to the sitting area near the window. "Please sit." She crossed the room and sat on the sofa. Vincent took the chair across from her, maintaining a careful distance. For a moment neither spoke, the silence filled with everything unsaid. "You look well," Vincent offered finally. "So do you." She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Powerful. Confident. Every bit the Don. "And you look free." Elena's smile softened. "I am. For the first time in my life, I actually am." Vincent leaned back in his chair. "Where have you been?" "A small town in Vermont, near the mountains. I bought a little house with the money from selling my mother's place. I've been teaching at the local elementary school. Teaching, art and music." Elena's eyes brightened. "The kids are wonderful. They don't know anything about my past, about this city, about any of it. They just know Miss Russo who helps them paint and sing." Vincent felt something twist in his chest. "It sounds peaceful." "It is." She looked down at her hands. "After my father died, I realized I needed to find out who I was without all the weight of history, without the anger and the shame and the fear. So I left. I thought I'd never come back. But you did come back." Elena met his gaze. "Because I had to tell you something, and I had to tell you in person." Vincent waited, his expression neutral, his heart beating faster than it had in years. Elena took a breath. "After the memorial service, after I left, I spent a lot of time thinking about what happened, about you bringing my father to the engagement party, about how you meant it as cruelty, but it became grace." She leaned forward slightly. "You changed my life, Vincent. You gave me back my father. You gave me 3 months with him that I never thought I'd have. And even though you didn't mean to, even though you were trying to hurt me, you freed me from 23 years of anger and grief." Vincent's jaw tightened. "I don't deserve your gratitude. Maybe not, but you have it anyway." Elena paused. "And I came back because I needed you to know something else. Something I realized while I was away." "What?" "That you're not the monster you think you are. You're not your father or your grandfather or any of the men who came before you. You're Vincent Marconi, and you're capable of more than you let yourself believe." Vincent stood abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, the city spread before him, the empire he commanded, the kingdom built on secrets and silence. "You don't know me anymore, Elena. If you ever really did. I know you better than you think." Elena rose and crossed to stand beside him. "I know you chose exile over execution for men who betrayed you. I know you've been rebuilding this family into something different than it was. I know you still think about that night at the engagement party, about my father, about choices and consequences." Vincent turned to look at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I still think about it too. Because some things change us so deeply that we carry them forever." They stood there, side by side, looking out at the city as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. "Why are you really here, Elena?" Vincent asked quietly. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She held it for a moment before handing it to him. Vincent took it and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, handwritten on simple paper. He recognized the shaky script immediately. Thomas Greco. He wrote this the week before he died, Elena said. He made me promise not to give it to you until I was ready, until I understood what it meant. Vincent unfolded the letter and read, Mr. Marconi, I don't know why you brought me to that party. My daughter says you meant it as revenge, and maybe that's true, but I've learned that intentions don't matter as much as outcomes. You gave me 3 months with my daughter. You gave me a chance to explain, to apologize, to love her before I died. That's more than most men get. I spent 23 years as a ghost because I thought disappearing was the only way to protect my family. I was wrong. Running away doesn't protect anyone. It just leaves wounds that never heal. You're a powerful man, Mr. Marconi. You have everything I never had, money, respect, control, but I see something in your eyes that I recognize. You're haunted by the same question I was. Is it better to be feared or loved? Is it better to have power or peace? I chose peace in the end, even though it cost me everything. I don't know what you'll choose, but I hope you find a way to have both, because a man who has power without love is just another kind of ghost. Thank you for bringing me home. Thomas Greco. Vincent read the letter twice, his throat tight. When he finished, he carefully refolded it and slid it back into the envelope. He knew, Vincent said finally. He understood what I was trying to do, and he forgave me anyway. He did more than that. Elena's voice was gentle. He saw you, Vincent. Really saw you. Not the Don, not the Marconi heir, but the man underneath all of it. The man who's afraid that power is all he'll ever have. Vincent turned away from the window. Why are you telling me this? Because I forgive you too. Elena stepped closer. I forgive you for trying to hurt me. I forgive you for not being able to leave this life. I forgive you for all the things you can't forgive yourself for. Vincent felt something break open inside him, something he had kept locked and sealed for so long he had forgotten it was there. His eyes burned, but he didn't let the tears fall. Not yet. Not in front of her. I don't know how to be anything other than this, he said, his voice rough. I don't know how to walk away. I'm not asking you to. Elena reached out and took his hand, the same way she had in the church 2 years ago. I'm just asking you to remember that you're more than the role you play. You're more than the family. You're a man who once brought a homeless stranger to a party and accidentally changed 3 lives forever. She squeezed his hand. That man is still in there, Vincent. Don't let him become a ghost. Vincent looked down at their joined hands, at the woman who had loved him once and walked away and somehow found her way back. What do you want from me, Elena? Nothing. She smiled. I don't want anything. I just wanted you to have that letter. I wanted you to know that my father saw the good in you, even when you couldn't see it yourself. And I wanted to thank you one last time, before I go back to my quiet life in the mountains. You're leaving again. Tomorrow morning. Vincent nodded slowly. Will you come back? Elena released his hand and stepped back. Maybe someday. When you're ready to be more than the Don. When you're ready to be just Vincent. She picked up her bag and slung it over her shoulder. Take care of yourself, Vincent Marconi. This city needs you, but don't let it consume you. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button. As she waited, she looked back at him one last time. You know, she said softly, my father told me something before he died. He said that the bravest thing a man can do is choose to be vulnerable, to let people see him without the armor, to risk being hurt for the chance to be loved. The elevator doors opened. I hope you find that courage someday, Elena said, because I think you'd be extraordinary if you did. Then she stepped into the elevator and was gone. Vincent stood alone in his office as the sun sank below the horizon and the city lights flickered on one by one. He walked to his desk and set the letter down carefully, as if it were something precious and fragile. Then he picked up his phone and called Marco. Get the car ready. We're going somewhere. Where, boss? St. Anthony's Church. 20 minutes later, Vincent stood in the small parking lot of the church where Thomas Greco's memorial service had been held. The building looked smaller in the twilight, humble and unassuming, a place of quiet faith in a loud city. Vincent walked up the steps and tried the door. It was unlocked. He stepped inside. The church was empty, lit only by votive candles flickering in red glass holders. Vincent walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He stopped at the front pew, the same place where Elena had sat during the service. He sat down and stared at the altar, at the simple wooden cross hanging above it. For a long time, Vincent just sat there, not praying exactly, but thinking about Thomas Greco, who had disappeared to save his family and found redemption in the end, about Elena, who had forgiven him when he didn't deserve it, about the letter, and the question it posed. Is it better to be feared or loved? Is it better to have power or peace? Vincent had spent his entire adult life choosing power. He had built an empire on it. He had shaped himself into something hard and untouchable, a man who could make decisions without flinching, who could order violence without losing sleep, who could stand alone at the top of the world and call it victory. But sitting here in this quiet church, with Thomas Greco's words echoing in his mind, Vincent finally allowed himself to ask a different question. What if there was another way? He thought about the conspiracy he had defeated, not with blood, but with mercy. He thought about the family he was rebuilding, trying to make it something more than just an organization of violence and fear. He thought about the younger soldiers who looked to him for guidance, who wanted to believe that the old ways could evolve into something better. And he thought about the man in the mirror, the one who looked back at him every morning with eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. Vincent bowed his head. He didn't pray because he didn't know how. He didn't ask for forgiveness because he didn't believe in redemption for men like him. But he made himself a promise, there in the silence of St. Anthony's Church, with the ghost of Thomas Greco listening. He promised to try to be more than the Don, to try to lead with both strength and humanity, to try to build something that might last beyond fear and violence, to try to be the man Elena and Thomas had somehow seen in him, buried under layers of armor and anger and inherited sins. He didn't know if he would succeed. He didn't know if change was even possible for someone who had spent so many years becoming what he was, but he would try. Vincent stood and walked back down the aisle. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at the altar one last time. "Thank you," he said quietly to the empty air, to the ghost of an old man who had taught him more than he ever expected to learn. Then he stepped out into the night. Marco was waiting by the car, patient and loyal as always. As Vincent approached, Marco opened the door. "Everything okay, boss?" Vincent paused before getting in. He looked up at the church, at its simple steeple reaching toward the stars. "Yeah, Marco, I think it will be." They drove back through the city streets, through neighborhoods where the Marconi name meant power and fear, where Vincent's word was law and his shadow reached into every corner. But as they passed people on the sidewalks, living their ordinary lives, Vincent found himself watching them differently. He saw a father walking hand in hand with his daughter. He saw an old couple sitting on their stoop, enjoying the cool evening air. He saw young men laughing together, their whole lives ahead of them, full of possibility and hope. He saw the city not as a kingdom to be ruled, but as a place where people tried to survive, to love, to build something meaningful in the small space between birth and death. And for the first time in a very long time, Vincent Marconi felt something other than the weight of his crown. He felt hope. It was fragile and uncertain, barely more than a flicker, but it was there, stubborn and persistent, refusing to be extinguished by all the years of darkness. That night, Vincent sat in his penthouse and took out Thomas Greco's letter. He read it one more time, slowly, letting each word sink in. Then he picked up a pen and began to write. Not a letter, not a confession, just thoughts, ideas, plans, ways to reshape the family into something that could adapt and survive, and maybe even do some good in a world that desperately needed it. Ways to balance power with mercy, strength with compassion, the old ways with new possibilities. He wrote until dawn broke over the city, until the first light touched the tops of the buildings and turned the streets from black to gray to gold. And when he finally set down his pen and looked out at the morning, Vincent Marconi made a decision. He would not walk away from who he was. He would not abandon the family or the empire or the responsibilities that came with being Don, but he would change what it meant to be all those things. He would lead differently, build differently, be different, not because Elena had asked him to, not because Thomas Greco had challenged him, but because he had finally understood something fundamental. Power without humanity was just another kind of death, and Vincent Marconi had spent enough years as a ghost. It was time to become a man again. The sun rose higher, flooding the penthouse with light. Vincent stood at the window, his father's ring on his finger, Thomas Greco's letter on his desk, and Elena's forgiveness in his heart. Below him, the city woke up. People went to work. Children walked to school. Life continued in its endless, complicated, beautiful patterns. And for the first time since he had become Don, Vincent Marconi smiled, not the cold smile of a man calculating advantages, not the dangerous smile that preceded violence, but a real smile, genuine and unguarded, the kind that reached all the way to his eyes, because he finally understood what Thomas Greco had tried to tell him. A man who has power without love is just another kind of ghost, but a man who finds the courage to be both powerful and vulnerable, to rule and to care, to lead and to learn, that man might actually change the world. Vincent turned away from the window and got back to work. But it was different work now, better work, the work of building a legacy that might actually be worth leaving behind. The city continued to turn, indifferent and eternal. But in one penthouse, in one heart, something had shifted. Vincent Marconi was still the Don, but he was also, finally, just Vincent, and that made all the difference. Years later, when people told stories about the Marconi family, they would talk about the night Vincent brought an old man to his ex-fiancée's engagement party. They would talk about the silence that fell when Elena recognized her father. They would talk about the funeral, the conspiracy, the exile of traitors who expected death but received mercy. But what they remembered most was what came after. They remembered the Don who rebuilt the family into something that could exist in the modern world without losing its soul. The Don who balanced strength with compassion, power with responsibility, tradition with innovation. They remembered Vincent Marconi, who learned from a homeless man that sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing when to be human. And they remembered that in a city built on shadows and silence, one man found the courage to step into the light. Not because he stopped being the Don, but because he finally understood what being the Don could mean. The story ended where it began, in the space between revenge and grace, between cruelty and kindness, between the man Vincent was and the man he chose to become. And in that space, something extraordinary happened. Not a transformation, not a redemption, just a man learning to carry his power with wisdom, his strength with mercy, and his past with forgiveness. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was an honest one, and in a world of shadows, that was enough.